Welcome. This is the final night of the series of public events in the Faith, Film, Philosophy 2024 series. I'm David Calhoun, Director of the Gonzaga Faith and Reason Institute. The Institute is the organizer of this series. Faith and Reason Institute explores and defends the complementarity of faith and reason as articulated in the Catholic intellectual tradition, especially in the areas of faith-science compatibility, the phenomenon of human suffering, the existence and nature of God, and philosophical theology. A final area of exploration of the Institute is the influence of Christian ideas in shaping culture and the use of tools from Christian thought to investigate and critique popular culture. This is the foundation for faith, film, and philosophy. Faith, film, and philosophy has a long history at Gonzaga, stretching back to the first series in 2007, and since then covering topics such as transformation, zombies, mystery, fantasy, love, and war, just to mention a few. We've had a number of stellar outside speakers address faith and popular culture over the years. The first public talk this year was offered by the former director of the Faith and Reason Institute, Dr. Brian Clayton, now emeritus professor of philosophy from Gonzaga, seated right up there in the top. He and his colleague, Dr. Richard McClellan, who's sitting right in front of him, wondered back in 2007 whether it might be possible to explore the supernatural themes of Clint Eastwood's Pale Rider in a conference. They decided it was possible, and Faith, Film, and Philosophy was subsequently born. It's a wonderful continuity to have Professors Clayton and McClellan back for Faith, Film, Philosophy 2024. Dr. Clayton gave the opening public talk this week on the films of M. Night Shyamalan, and Dr. McClellan will be discussing work of his at the Faith, Film, Philosophy Seminar, which is a non-public correlate to this series of public events that this talk tonight is part of. Thank you to both of them. Actually, I want to say thank you. It's also been wonderful to welcome back several seminar participants from years ago to the seminar this year. That's again the group of scholars that talk about faith and film issues. There's a handful of 14 folks in the group up here that are involved in that seminar. Again, welcome to them. While I'm offering thanks, I'd like to thank the friends and donors who makes events supported by the Institute possible. The Institute is generously supported by the Father Robert J. Spitzer Society of Jesus Leadership Fund, which was created when Father Robert Spitzer retired as Gonzaga's president in 2009. Father Spitzer, by the way, is not only was the president of the university, president of Gonzaga University for a period from the 90s till 2009, but he also was the co-founder of the Faith and Reason Institute. So we are proud to look back to and thank Father Spitzer. A great number of friends of Father Spitzer and of Gonzaga contributed to the fund bearing his name over the years, and that fund makes events like tonight's talk possible. The specific topical focus of Faith, Film, Philosophy this year contrasts the spiritual to the phenomenon of secularism by investigating spiritual film themes in a secular age. There's no doubt that Western culture has moved away from a presumption in favor of theism and the religious toward vague forms of spirituality and even outright rejection of religion. What space, if any, is there left for religious and spiritual themes in popular film? Our speaker last night, Dr. Michael Foley from Baylor, addressed this question by exploring a secular stage, religion through the lens of Hollywood. Our speaker tonight addresses the same question of secularism from a slightly different angle. Sorry, technical stuff here. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Duane Armitage, who is a former colleague of ours in the philosophy department here at Gonzaga from a decade ago, but he now is associate professor of philosophy at the University of Scranton in Pennsylvania. Armitage is a scholar of continental philosophy with specialization in Nietzsche and Heidegger, especially the theological dimensions of their thought. His books include Heidegger and the Death of God and Philosophy's Violent Sacred, Heidegger and Nietzsche through Mimetic Theory, which I want to mention and emphasize, both of which are available on the book table outside, along with maybe one copy left of Little Ideas, or Big Ideas for Little Philosophers. I think I see some folks have snatched up 2 copies already. I think there's one left, which is, if you're wondering, they're hard board books for babies about philosophy. So scratch your head on that one. Think about that. So, and there are also books by other speakers from the public film series this week that are available on the table out there. I hope you'll stop and take a look on your way out. Dr. Armitage has special interest in the social, cultural, and theological implications of the death of God, which leads us directly to the subject of his talk tonight, the displacement of the sacred in modern film nihilism from Nietzsche and Heidegger to Barbie and Deadpool. Welcome with me, if you would, Dr. Duane Armitage.
Buying the books out there. I also have a YouTube channel. Like and subscribe, hit the notification for more. By the way, this is 10 p.m. for me on the East Coast, so it's getting a little late for me, so I'm getting a little sleepy. The title, I gave them the title before I wrote the paper, so it will be a little bit abridged here, a little amended. It will be Barbie, let's say Deadpool, Marvel Universe, etc. Okay, so I'll talk about a couple different things. I have some clips I want to show, but depending on time, I'll check in. So it'll be half philosophy, half analysis of movies. And if there's time, I'll show the clips. If not, we'll get to the Q&A. Okay, so the theme of this conference is whether there exists a space for religion within our secular age. By our secular age, I understand this to mean the age of the so-called, by Nietzsche, death of God. My thesis, so I like to start, just tell you exactly what I'm going to say, but we'll have to unpack it. My thesis is, indeed, there is a space for the sacred, but it's often unconscious and displaced. So we're not aware of it, and filmmakers are not aware of it. Now, Adorno famously argued that popular art reflects culture, whereas good art critiques it. Popular art is a mirror that reflects cultural values, whereas good art resists such values. In this sense, then, popular film reflects our secular age and culture, and thus popular film, I'd argue, reflects the death of God. So I think you see the death of God in every film. When David asked me to do the conference, I thought, I don't really watch movies, do I? Do I watch movies? No, I do. I'm getting into arguments about them. So I found out writing this paper, I have a lot of thoughts on this. And you see this is a theme, hopefully after the talk you'll see everywhere once you watch a movie. You won't be able to unsee this. So popular film reflects the death of God, but how exactly? At times by unconsciously worshiping, deifying, and sacralizing. At others by displacing or transmuting the sacred altogether. As we shall see, this implicit and unconscious deification occurs regardless of what certain films think they are saying about religion or faith, regardless of whether they think they have rejected theism or traditional Judeo-Christian values and metaphysics. Thus, I will be employing a suspicious hermeneutics, just means a suspicious form of interpretation toward modern film, in particularly toward reading secularist culture in films broadly. Then I will briefly show how the secularism finds itself implicit in specific films. So, my claim is that we are still religious, but almost totally unaware of it. And this shows up in contemporary film, albeit in a confused manner. We seem to want to eradicate the sacred, but we cannot. The sacred is like a stain that will cannot come out, despite our greatest efforts. Finally, I also want to discuss the logical implications, or rather the implicit logic, in this confused, unconscious sacred and secularism in contemporary film. Now, to flesh out my thesis, or theses, I want to briefly discuss 3 thinkers on the death of God and secularism: Friedrich Nietzsche, Martin Heidegger, and René Girard. Each of these thinkers contribute something essential to the idea of the death of God and the replacement or displacement of the sacred. That is, each thinker agrees that with secularization, God does not so much die as become replaced. The sacred moves elsewhere. Note, Heidegger was a deep reader of Nietzsche, and Girard a deep reader of Heidegger and Nietzsche, so I'll present their ideas, the ideas of each thinker somewhat fluidly and together. And after discussing Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Girard, I'll turn to the application of their philosophical diagnoses in contemporary film. So, part 1. When asking where is the sacred in culture and film, we're essentially asking what is the unifying narrative or underlying ground of film or of culture. However, I must confess, watching the most recent popular films, and I was talking about this today, I find myself struggling at the end if I can finish the movie. Now, I've gone to the movies maybe 10 times in the last 5 years. I've walked out of 5 of the movies. And I've left the other 5 saying, I have no idea what that movie was about. Hitman, Twister, the new Beetlejuice I just watched on the airplane here, I have no idea what the movie was about. Now, there's an interesting quote from Nietzsche's notebooks on the death of God. He says, in the death of God or in nihilism, the why finds no answer. That's exactly what I'm thinking. What was the point of this movie? Especially Twister. There was no love story at the end. Anyway, so we'll begin with Nietzsche and ask a twofold question. Where, according to Nietzsche, was the sacred, and where is it now? So, for Nietzsche, his diagnosis is obviously God is dead. That is, as he puts it, the highest values of Western culture have devalued themselves. The why finds no answer. Now, Nietzsche inquires as to what the term God really stands for. That is, what's behind this highest value? What's the term God really mean? And essentially, I think he argues that God is a stand-in for 2 values. First, truth, this value of truth. And secondly, what we would call today social justice, or the victim ethic, or the concern for victims. God, Western culture's highest values are truth, which eventuated into the values still held by modern science, which for Nietzsche, he argues modern science is the latest instantiation of Christianity, or the ascetic ideal. And social justice, or the concern for victims, the oppressed, marginalized, etc., in short, the mercy ethic. For Nietzsche, in order to respond aptly to the death of God, we must uncover, via his suspicious hermeneutics, the origin or genealogy of these values. That is, how do values like truth and social justice become the highest values? Many of you are likely familiar somewhat with Nietzsche's genealogy, where he argues that the values of Western culture arose by the way of the slave revolt, immorality, where the weak and those dispossessed of power changed the rules of the power game of nature and made weakness good and power evil. Weakness, oppression, or simply being a victim is now good and righteous, whereas having power or being excellent is somehow evil and oppressive. In short, the ressentiment, as the word Nietzsche uses, of the weak fixed and created a new value system that deemed ipso facto their lot of weakness as somehow good, and that anyone holding power, for example, the strong, the rich, the beautiful, the competent, as somehow having oppressed their way to the top. Such is the origin of social justice for Nietzsche. As for the value of truth, which includes not just the search for truth, but being true, or the value of telling the truth. Why is it better to tell the truth and not just lie? Such valuing has its origin for Nietzsche. Like social justice, justice is in the denial of this world, of inequality, of becoming in favor of a transcendent world, or underlying world of fixed being or truth or essences. In short, valuing truth or being arises from what Nietzsche says in Thus Spake Zarathustra, a revenge against time and its passing. So that's where truth comes from. We can't stand that reality is chaotic and changes, so we posit this stable thing that can stand still, and we can say it is the case or it is true. Essentially, both truth and social justice constitute, this is important for what I'm going to talk about, the metaphysical, called the metaphysical, that is going beyond the physical, splitting the world in two, in effect. The true world, the intelligible, the supersensible, versus the apparent world of the sensible and visible. Judeo-Christianity, which for Nietzsche is simply Platonism for the people, Plato posited the split world, posits another world upon which this world is grounded. This includes not only the transcendent world of heaven, where God dwells, and where victims will be rewarded, and the powerful will be tortured endlessly, but also the underlying intelligible world of essences, mathematics, scientific laws, that science via reason comes to map itself onto and understand. Now, what happens when God dies with these values? Well, for Nietzsche, firstly, the Judeo-Christian ethic gets detached from its metaphysics. That is, the mercy ethic of social justice is stripped of its narrative. Nevertheless, the ethic remains intact. What does such an ethic stripped of its narrative look like? What does such an ethic stripped of its narrative look like? We know exactly what it looks like, an underlying metaphysics of power coupled with a concern for victims. We call it in 2024, sometimes negatively or pejoratively, wokeism or postmodernism, sometimes it's called neo-Marxism. You'll understand the logic of it pretty quickly. The metaphysics of power coupled with the concern for victims. Now, why power? Well, power remains, after all that's left, it's sort of the logical conclusion once a transcendent narrative is removed. If power, now think about this, if we understand the world in terms of power, well then some people have it, some people don't. And so group identity becomes the primary way you look at the world, or identity politics, which is very popular now. Since power obviously bifurcates into strong and weak, which then can be divided in terms of race, gender, sex, sexual orientation, class, etc. Yet what remains of Judeo-Christianity is the mercy ethic, the concern for victims. Indeed, we see on both sides of the political spectrum, this concern for victims, and it's really a battle on the right and the left over who the victim really is. Is it minorities, members of the LGBT community, women, or is it the forgotten blue-collar worker or the straight white man who is in fear of being replaced? So both sides of the political spectrum use this ethic. More recently, Israel and Palestine. Who exactly are the victimizers? Who's the victim? This is what the debates are all about. Regardless, a consequence of the death of God remains a kind of postmodern political ideology that weaponizes the mercy ethic or concern for victims for Nietzsche, and remains merely the latest instantiation of the resentment of slave morality. Thus, we could say postmodern metaphysics of power, group identity, and concern for victims remains the first place where the value of God becomes displaced. The victim, in general, becomes deified. The other place of deification or displacement, as alluded to above, is in modern science, with its question of the underlying structures and intelligibility of reality, which in turn still, for Nietzsche, splits the world in two. Indeed, Nietzsche calls the modern atheistic scientist, this is in essay 324 of the Genealogy, one of my favorite passages, think of Richard Dawkins, as one who is duped by his intellectual cleanliness, and who is unable to see that he is, in effect, Dr. Richard Dawkins, is still a kind of Christian, insofar as he still believes in a metaphysical world of underlying truth and intelligibility. That is, the scientist, like the Christian, still splits the world in two, believing in an underlying world of intelligibility or being beneath the world of appearances. Therefore, we could say, for Nietzsche, the sacred in modernity, post-death of God, is displaced into the postmodern value of concern for victims and the scientific value of truth. The irony is that these values are often found united together. A postmodern perspectivism with an underlying metaphysics of power that looks for victimization at every turn, but also one that holds sacred scientific truth, one that follows the science, which assumes a kind of underlying intelligible world which reason can access. Nietzsche, of course, argues, and thus agrees with the postmodernists, that reason itself is a farce and has no access to reality, since there is no reality to access, only an endless recurring flux of chaotic becoming. There is no truth as what is for reason to locate. Rather, only power and perspectives of power. Nietzsche, however, rejects strongly the concern for victims as preserving life sick and disinherited, essentially a preserving of weakness and a leveling and diminishing of strength and excellence. This is in Nietzsche's Antichrist. Now, Nietzsche's response to the death of God, this is more applicable to what we're talking about. His solution lies in the figure of, I'm sure you've heard this term before, the Übermensch. Okay, the Übermensch, who, as far as I can tell, from stitching together various passages in Nietzsche dispersed throughout his work, is constituted by three characteristics. So the Übermensch, or the Superman, or the meta-human, like in the DC universe, it's constituted by three characteristics: value creation, freedom from resentment, and laughter. That is, the Übermensch, recognizing the truth of metaphysical nihilism, acts freely to create values ex nihilo, painting meaning upon the meaningless canvas of becoming, out of strength and not weakness, and transmuting suffering by way of laughter. Laughter for Nietzsche, by the way, is schadenfreude with a good conscience. It is delighting in the misfortune of others, but with some healthy distance, which is kind of hard not to prove that wrong when you really think about it. Anyway, Heidegger, in discussing Nietzsche's Übermensch, says that Nietzsche's entire philosophy can be summarized in one sentence, and that is, this is the one thought that Nietzsche was thinking, even when he failed to be explicit about it. So Heidegger thinks you can distill Nietzsche down to one sentence, and the sentence from Thus Spake Zarathustra on Tarantulas, a very famous passage, runs, that man, or that humans be delivered from revenge, this is for me the highest hope and a rainbow after long storms. That man be delivered from revenge, or human beings be delivered from revenge, this is for me the highest hope and a rainbow after long storm. Now, Nietzsche often speaks in his published writings of the way to overcome revenge as through this kind of thought experiment of thinking of the eternal return of the same, imagining reality on an infinite loop, time as a flat circle, and one's reaction to that. So you imagine time as on this infinite loop, and your reaction to that dictates whether you're the Übermensch or not. Namely, are you repulsed by the idea or do you celebrate it? However, there is evidence in Nietzsche's unpublished writings that Nietzsche thought of the eternal return not only as this kind of psychological experiment, but also the way in which reality was constituted. How do I pull this? There's a quote here I wanted to read from Nietzsche. Can you see that right there? Yeah. Okay. Nietzsche writes, if the world may be thought as a certain definite quantity of force and a certain definite number of centers of forces, and every other representation remains indifferent and therefore useless, it follows that in the great dice game of existence, it must pass through a calculable number of combinations. In infinite time, every possible combination would at some time be realized, it'd be realized an infinite number of times. It sense between every combination and next recurrence, all other possible combinations. I'm reading this fast so I get through it, but you have to sort of hear it so you get the idea. Would take its place in each of these combinations, conditions the entire sequence of combinations in the same series. A circular movement of absolutely identical series is thus demonstrated. The world as a circular movement that has already repeated itself indefinitely. I'll leave these quotes up because I'm coming back to them. In other words, given an infinite number of things, given a finite number of things in an infinite time, reality will repeat itself and will repeat itself eternally. Time is a flat circle of infinite worlds, infinitely recurring. The understanding of the world, and infinitely recurring and simultaneously recurring. And so this understanding of the world as eternal return or eternal recurring remains the only way to conceive the world intelligibly, apart from grounding this world upon this metaphysical split world, or split structure. That is, the eternal return remains the only way of overcoming metaphysics for Nietzsche. Now, Heidegger famously argued that, quote, Nietzsche's, I can't remember if this is me saying this or if this is Heidegger, but this was also a question I had on my comps. If you, when you hear this, you're going to they gave just one question and you had to write on it. It was, no, so Heidegger famously argued that Nietzsche's overturning of metaphysics is just as metaphysical as the metaphysics it sought to overturn. Nietzsche's overturning of metaphysics is just as metaphysical as the metaphysics it sought to overturn. That was the question I had to write on. It was like, discuss. I had to write 5 pages on that, or blue book on that. In other words, Nietzsche, in his attempt to overcome metaphysics, remained, unbeknownst to Nietzsche, even ever more stuck and entrenched in metaphysics. But how? For Heidegger, Nietzsche's understanding of the world as will to power and nothing besides, that's a quote from his notebooks, still in a way, for Heidegger, splits the world in two by placing the ground of meaning within the human subject, in its value positing and value creation in the will to power. That is the existential human subject. That is, for Heidegger, Nietzsche is the eventuality of the Cartesian term, where for Heidegger the subject becomes the ultimate ground of reality. The metaphysical world now resides in the human subject. The subject and the subject's perspectivism becomes deified, or excuse me, the subject's perspective becomes deified for Heidegger. For Heidegger, the human subject and the will to power then become the place of the displaced sacred. So Heidegger argues, no, really where the sacred now is, unbeknownst to Nietzsche, is in Nietzsche's understanding of the human being as one that creates value, okay, and reduces things to mere objects of control, which is what Heidegger's critique of technology is all about. Now, for Heidegger, this displacement of the sacred is simultaneously an eclipse of the sacred, a forgetting of being as polyvalent or many-meaning, and a flight of the gods and of the sacred. For Heidegger, the death of God is the movement of the sacred into the realm of the human subject. Now, Heidegger's solution is denken, or thinking in German, deconstructing the deconstruction of modernity's reductionism and coming to unveil being as truth and aletheia, which shows the polyvalency of being, the many meanings of reality. Heidegger argues that this can take place only via a new poetic discourse that can nominate the hidden and forgotten meanings of being into appearance. And I always think of, when I read this, Heidegger's response to maybe a Terrence Malick movie is trying to do this, show the many facets of nature and the many meanings of being. Anyway, for Heidegger, in some metaphysics, metaphysica proper is, again, the split world of the true and apparent worlds, the grounding of one world upon the other, of things upon being or meaning. The death of God marks the collapse of the supersensible and the rerouting of meaning into the modern subject, i.e., namely Nietzscheanism. Now, very quickly, according to René Girard, Heidegger's philosophy in particular is rendering of Nietzsche as the last metaphysician amounts to a kind of whitewashing of Nietzsche. So I always get this question. You study Heidegger. Heidegger was notoriously involved with the Nazi Party. Girard says, well, what Heidegger's really guilty of is taking Nietzsche, who's the real core of Nazism, and sort of whitewashing it and turning it not into the Antichrist, but into the last metaphysician, ignoring Nietzsche's Antichrist and his explicit critique of Christian morality. That is, according to Girard, the essence of Nietzsche's philosophy lies in the uncovering and critique of Christian morality. Now, this is interesting. Nietzsche himself says in Ecce Homo, which is a book reflecting on his own philosophy, what defines me, what sets me apart from the whole rest of humanity, is that I have uncovered Christian morality. And he says this in the chapter titled Why I Am a Destiny. Also, the other chapters are Why I Write Such Excellent Books, Why I Am No Man, I Am Dynamite. So this is Nietzsche, very happy with himself. Nietzsche not only uncovered Christian morality, but the essence of Western culture as well, and in turn, it's collapsed with the death of God. For Girard, now, the story of Christ's lynching is indeed the moral foundation of Western culture and its values. Yet the story of the Passion is itself as much of the Hebrew Bible, for René Girard, an inversion of all mythology prior. which had determined the victims of violence guilty, not innocent. Consider, for example, Oedipus, who is guilty and is banished and tears his eyes out precisely for killing his father and marrying his mother. Stories like Joseph and Potiphar's wife for Girard amount to a retelling of the Oedipus story from the victim's perspective. Indeed, the entire Hebrew Bible is simply the retelling of mythology from the victim's perspective, until such culminates in the highest expression of innocent scapegoating in the Passion. For Girard, all narrative is mythological and all mythology is religious, so any form of story is likely to have a sacred center to it. We could apply that to film as well. Yet strangely, for Girard, what marks the essence of all narrative, all mythology, is scapegoating. Scapegoating is the center of the narrative, having someone to blame, having an enemy. This blaming in turn unifies those watching, listening, or committing the act of scapegoating. Indeed, for Girard, group formation occurs precisely via scapegoating and holding of a common enemy. Christianity now inverts this scapegoating, showing the victim as innocent. Now, for Girard, with the death of God and the collapse of the other world, comes, just as Nietzsche suspected, a caricatural, hyper or ultra-Christianity, namely the Christian concern for victims, as Girard says, detached from any transcendence. Girard calls this, what we have called postmodernism already, the Antichrist proper, since it apes Christ. Michael was talking about this last night, and I'm going to quote the same passage he quoted. Since it apes Christ, here the concern for victims is fused with scapegoating and violence of any and all perceived victimizers. It is a question then as to whether the metaphysics of power can operate with the concern for victims without scapegoating. It appears that for Nietzsche and Girard, it cannot. Girard writes, and this is a quote that sort of summarizes the second quote. I'll get a chance to look at that. I'll read it very quickly. The current process of spiritual demagoguery and rhetorical overkill has transformed the concern for victims into a totalitarian command and a permanent inquisition. The most powerful anti-Christian movement is the one that takes over and radicalizes the concern for victims in order to paganize it. The powers and principalities want to be revolutionary now, and they reproach Christianity for not defending victims with enough ardor. In Christian history, they see nothing but persecutions, acts of oppression, inquisitions. They denounce the Christian concern for victims as hypocritical and a pale imitation of the authentic crusade against oppression and persecution for which they would carry the banner themselves. In the symbolic language of the New Testament, we would say that in our world, Satan, trying to make a new start and gain new triumphs, borrows the language of victims. Satan imitates Christ better and better and presents to surpass him. The New Testament evokes this as the Antichrist. Okay, so this will be important when we talk in a little bit. Anyway, okay. So Girard then draws a similar conclusion. Nietzsche, albeit in a slightly different register and for different reasons, secularism weaponizes the concern for victims. So in summary, and we're almost ready to go to part two, what we see with these three thinkers is the diagnosis of the cultural death of God as the rerouting of the sacred elsewhere, toward victims, toward the other world, in science, toward the human subject. For Girard, failure to acknowledge this is unknowingly to participate in the Antichrist, or we could even say the demonic. Okay, so part two, I'm at 7:27. I'll see how fast I get through this, and I'll show the clips after. So I'll get through, and then I'll show the clips. So turning to film now, the way in which we see this cultural diagnosis reflected in the displacement and confusion of modern film. First, some general points, and I've been thinking about these for at least 10 years now. What we see in modern film is twofold. One, metaphysics contradicting ethics. Two, metaphysics unable to justify ethics. The prime example for me, and the one I use in my classes often, is the new Star Wars trilogy, although you can argue that it's in the prequels and even the original ones. But the best example is The Last Jedi. Essentially, when Luke is teaching Rey, is about the Force, and this is a quote from Palpatine, I don't know if you remember this from the prequels, she's taught to embrace a larger view of the Force. Not just, my one friend in grad school used to say, he was an atheist, I was a theist, and he'd always say, you must embrace a larger view of the Force, not just the narrow teachings of the Jesuits, because Palpatine says, not just the narrow teachings of the Jedi. Namely, the Force is all about balance, especially in The Last Jedi. Balance of light and dark, violence and peace, good and evil, balance. Except the rest of the movie and the rest of the trilogy is all about fighting injustice and oppression and victimization. What do we say by this logic? Then we need a balance of victimization, anti-victimization, oppression and anti-oppression. Good to have a little racism and a little sexism to balance it out. This is obviously absurd, okay? But does not seem to occur to the mind of the writers that their metaphysics makes no sense and cannot justify, but in fact contradicts the ethics. Interestingly, you get the sense at the end of The Last Jedi that there's a perpetual polemos, an unending war between good and evil, the rebels and the empire, which is basically the point of the new trilogy. Evil can't be defeated. We'll return to this point later. No, by the way, I remember noticing this when I was 8 years old and I saw The Lion King and the circle of life metaphysics, that the circle of life is the circle of violence, except violence was bad against, Mufasa and right? There were clear lines of good and evil, but the circle of life seemed to be very Nietzschean. So a Nietzschean quote here is very appropriate, and I won't tell you what it means. Just see if you can think about this, but it sort of applies to these last two. We'll talk about it maybe at the Q&A. He says this from his notebooks. He who believes in morality passes sentence on existence. He who believes in morality passes sentence on existence. Okay, the second point, generally, the metaphysics of film is unable to justify the ethics, while maybe not obviously contradicting, which essentially means there is no metaphysics or the metaphysics is meaningless. Some examples. Now, my favorite example of this is from the original Matrix trilogy. You have the split between the two worlds, the real world and the apparent world. The real world, however, is much worse, which is why Cypher wanted to go back to the Matrix. The real world had no world of ultimate meaning, which is why, and this is maybe the worst scene in the whole trilogy, Agent Smith is fighting Neo, and he's going, "Why, Mr. Anderson? Why do you do it? Why do you keep fighting?" And the best they could come up with, the Wachowskis, was, "Because I choose to." This was the only, and I remember thinking, what? This is why he's doing it? Because he chooses to? So it lands on existentialism. I don't know, I'm just making the choice. But that's what sort of makes sense when you don't have a metaphysics to back it up. Now, a more contemporary example of this inability to justify ethics by metaphysics includes the Marvel Universe as a whole. The Marvel Universe as a whole has no ground of ultimate reality, as it did in the comic books. Now, in the comic books, there's a God. God is called the One Who is Above All. And he appears to Spider-Man once. He appears a few times. Once is to Spider-Man. And many people, including myself on Reddit, we thought Stan Lee was going to be the one who was above all. Like, but then maybe he died. I don't know. They changed the ending. Now, in the original ending of Endgame, in the comic books, it's not. I don't even know what happens at the original. I was waiting for this too, and I was telling we were speculating about it. I guess God's divine council gets involved and has to stop Thanos because he gets too powerful. Well, that whole thing was scrapped, I guess. In the films, there's no transcendence other than the sort of Nietzschean many worlds or timelines, which are governed by the time variant authority in the Loki series or in Deadpool, or the quantum world in Ant-Man. Indeed, I think the multiverse is entirely unconsciously Nietzschean. In other words, I think both Nietzsche and Disney are trying to think of a universe without transcendence. In Doctor Strange, it's even suggested that Dormammu, I think that's his name, governs the transcendent world, which is entirely evil and ruled by the dark presence. When Doctor Strange's mentor, the Ancient One, Tilda Swinton, from the Witch from Narnia, when she's about to die, there's a strong implication there's no afterlife. Now, in Deadpool 2, there does appear to be something like an afterlife in heaven. He has a near-death experience and sees his girlfriend on the other side. But this is entirely expunged in Deadpool 3, where the Nietzschean multiverse or infinite timelines, or the timelines, whatever, hence all the various iterations of Deadpool. There's a bunch, he fights all different versions of himself in there. None of these are transcendent grounds for the ethical expressions, however, of sacrificial love, sacrifice, anti-victimization that guide the plots of the Marvel movies. Deadpool sacrifices himself at the end of Deadpool 3. And he even anybody know what he refers to himself as in that movie? Marvel Jesus? That's what he calls himself. But why? Why is he Marvel? And moreover, what justifies this ontologically? There isn't any justification. Tony Stark dies for everyone at the end of Endgame, and he also sacrificed himself in the first Avengers and sort of falls to earth in a Christ pose. Clearly, the Christian ethic of sacrificial love is still operative, but without the transcendent ground to justify it. Nietzsche would say, why is that preferable? Nietzsche would say, why is sacrifice preferable to domination and victimization? Why is it better to care about the weak than the strong? There remains no reason for Nietzsche, at least. Finally, this is a movie that came up today, Everything Everywhere All at Once, which posits masterfully the nihilistic and absurdist view of the universe as infinite timelines, infinite worlds devoid of any meaning. However, what is the movie about? It's about how love can give meaning amidst the chaos. There is even a scene, and I was going to show it, but it's so cringe, I can't show it. It's just type in Everything Everywhere All at Once, be kind. And they're all killing each other, and all of a sudden the guy just says, let's stop and let's just be kind to one another. And I don't know, I went, what the, why? Why would you do that? So it's not clear why this is good. Now, what Nietzsche would say is 2,000 years of catechesis in Judeo-Christianity. We cannot, this is a stain that won't come out. We cannot shake this ethic. In other words, the axiom of kindness, love, and sacrifice is only self-evident because of Christianity. In sum, there remains no transcendent world in film. The other world, which is radically immanent, is exactly the way Nietzsche described it: chaotic, eternal becoming without meaning, only power, perhaps, occurring simultaneously ad infinitum. Now, two more points, and this will connect to Barbie. There have been other attempts, perhaps unconsciously and most recently in Barbie, and I don't know if you saw the Ryan Reynolds film, which I liked, Free Guy, to have the kind of split world, metaphysics. So in Barbie, there's a split world. In Free Guy, there's the split world, and there's some connection between the two. Barbie, you have Barbie world and the real world. They both seem to affect one another. In Free Guy, Ryan Reynolds is a video game character that becomes self-aware. Thus, the real world affects the world of the video game. In both of these movies, the characters become self-aware. In Barbie, which is much more in line with existentialism from the mid-20th century, Barbie becomes self-aware via thoughts of death. Exactly in the Heideggerian manner, where death as one's own most possibility, or Heidegger says the possibility of the impossibility of all other possibilities. That's what death is. Death is the possibility of the impossibility of all other possibilities. And it makes her realize the project of possibility that she is. That is, death as the end of possibilities mirrors to us that we are a project of possibility, that we're free. For Heidegger, indeed, death awakens us to our freedom, just like in Barbie. Now, in Free Guy, Ryan Reynolds awakens to freedom by love. He meets the avatar of the woman that the video game programmer was in love with, and so he falls in love with her. So you have love versus death as an occasion for awakening self-consciousness and freedom. Also in Free Guy, Ryan Reynolds, awakened by love, starts doing altruistic things for people in the video game, so it's possible to see this as an instantiation of traditional Christian metaphysics. But to return to Barbie. Barbie I find most fascinating because it has several philosophical themes running parallel at once, without seemingly much interaction, namely the existentialist and the feminist. Perhaps this isn't as strange as it might seem, since feminism, second wave feminism, begins properly with Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex, or existential feminism, within which I think all the seeds of later feminism are already contained. That is, because we're free, our gender is something distinct from our sex. That is, the gender-sex distinction is implied in Woman is not born, she's made, the most famous quote from that book, which is a reappropriation, by the way, I think, of the existence, essence distinction in Sartre. Sartre gets this from Heidegger, who gets it from Kierkegaard. That we are precedes what we are. Barbie begins and ends in existentialism. Barbie awakens to her freedom by way of contemplation of her death. The movie ends with a pure affirmation of her existential freedom to create herself. Note the song at the end of the movie, Billie Eilish, is her name? What Was I Made For? Barbie rejects her original essence given to her by patriarchal Mattel in favor of pure freedom, or it turns out she rejects the essence given to her by her creator, Ruth Handler, who encourages her at the end to do so. Now, regarding Barbie world, feminists like de Beauvoir, but also Schulmeth Firestone and Monique Wittig, if you've not read them, I highly recommend, they've argued that patriarchy is actually in nature. That is, it's the result of women's slavery to the reproductive process. Hence, women should liberate themselves of motherhood and of men. Men more so in Wittig, who argues that all women should become lesbians. This is also in Firestone, I'm not making this up. Motherhood enslaves women to the weaker role of the caretaker of the child. Firstly, Barbie world as a feminist utopia, I think, only works since the characters have no sex organs. Now, this might seem like a stretch, but hold on. It is reproduction which enslaves women to men. The men have no claim on the women, since the women do not need the men for reproduction. Nietzsche says, by the way, there's always a Nietzsche quote on men and women. He says, for woman, the man is always only the means to the child. Ken, this is a clip I will show at the end. Ken asks Barbie to sleep over. I don't know if you remember this in the movie. Barbie says, for what? And Ken goes, I don't know. Now, Firestone, this is a quote from Firestone's Dialectic of Sex. Nature produced the fundamental inequality. Half of the human race must bear and rear the children of all of them, which was later consolidated, institutionalized in the interest of men. Reproduction of the species cost women dearly. Women were the slave class that maintained the species. It's from the Dialectic of Sex, 184, if you're interested. Secondly, the ethics of Barbie world, where women occupy positions of power, at least in the beginning, is not about equality with men, but domination over men. That is, Barbie world is an inversion of the real world, an inversion of its patriarchal power structure, which can only occur because of no reproduction, I think. Thus, the ethic of Barbie world, perhaps consistently, does not seek to justify itself in the real world, but rather presents a kind of feminist Marxist inversion of the power structures of the real world, the most one can hope for without a transcendent metaphysics. What am I doing on time? Okay. Thus, the metaphysics operative in Barbie appears to be, on one level, the metaphysics of power. Finally, Barbie and existential freedom. Given the underlying metaphysics of power and how that fails in Barbie world, the real point of the movie appears to be existential freedom, the absolute value of self-determination, which is where the movie ends. That is, the movie ends not in advocating for something ethical, but it seems rather in pure freedom, where this amounts to a critique of feminism, or whether this amounts to a critique of feminism to me isn't clear. Barbie's rejection of her essence in favor of self-creation, however, I think runs into philosophical problems, the same philosophical problems that the Nietzschean Übermensch, who also lauded nothing but freedom and self-creation, runs into. That is, if there remains no standard or essence by which to determine oneself and one's choices, why ought one to choose one choice over the other? That is, how can one create oneself or create values if one does not already value something? Not even noting the problem of why value creation itself. It seems that the choice itself for one value over another cannot justify itself, since there remains no determining ground of the choice, no telos other than the choice itself, which would be rendered inert. Now, Hubert Dreyfus discusses this problem in his last chapter of Being in the World, text on Heidegger, where he compares Heideggerian and Nietzschean authenticity to religiousness A and B in Kierkegaard. Religiousness A, pure self-creation according to Dreyfus, fails since it cannot justify its choosing. Indeed, now Kierkegaard refers to this wanting to be a self apart from God, i.e. a transcendent standard, as itself the demonic and the satanic forms of despair in the concept of anxiety and the sacred son of death, respectively. So with the mentioning of the demonic, I'd like to end with the question as to whether or not there's a connection between this rejection of the transcendent and the demonic. I'll talk a little bit about horror films for a minute. In most recent horror films, for example, the new Exorcist film, but also films like Smile, Longlegs, etc., a few fascinating and disturbing things seem to recur. One, evil is absolutely indestructible. It always wins in the end. Good never triumphs over evil. Secondly, in the new Exorcist, Jesus' name cannot even cast out the demons. The priests have no power over evil, and one wonders whether there is even good. In the movie, Linda Blair's, it was the mother, I think? Linda Blair's mother comes in when the demon, they get her, and she comes in, and instead of going, in the name of Jesus Christ, she goes, in the name of all holy beings. And I thought, oh, come on, really? They took Christianity right out of it. You can't, yeah. In short, evil is not only more powerful than good, but it appears to be the only existing ontological reality. Evil exists, not God. This, I think, is the eventuality of the rejection of the transcendent in film, and thus in modern culture. A nihilistic multiverse devoid of meaning and morality, which very quickly devolves, or perhaps better put, reveals itself for what it really is, a world where evil remains the immanent transcendent. In short, Nietzsche's Antichrist. However, most films don't quite reach this conclusion, where evil is more powerful than good. No, most films, like those in Marvel and Star Wars, remain either unable to account for their ethics by their metaphysics, or films' ethics are in contradiction. Films like Barbie, which land on the existential, wind up being devoid of purpose and meaning in charging the main character with the task of creating it. Perhaps the film would have had more meaning if it gave in to the idea of destroying patriarchy. So, where exactly then is the sacred in modern film? We see the sacred in several places. First and foremost, in the victim and in the defense of victims, which we owe to Christianity. Heroes like those in the Marvel verse who sacrifice themselves for others. The sacrifice for victims and the fighting of victimizers assumes the Christian morality, according to Nietzsche and Girard, of good versus evil, where good is anti-oppression and the defense of victims, and evil, whether it be Thanos or the explicit Nazi like Red Skull in Captain America, the villains are always pure victimizers. Yet movies that radically embrace secularism have no way of justifying or giving meaning to this ethic, sometimes outrightly and explicitly contradicting it. More and more, too, we see a yearning for the metaphysical world, the split world, upon which this world is grounded, a kind of behind the scenes, in the time-varying authority, the multiverse, the quantum world, the astral world in Dr. Strange, the real world in Barbie. I see this fascination with the split world as a remnant of the sacred. Furthermore, we see scientific attempts at being metaphysical. That is, we try to explain the metaphysical world in terms of quantum or multiverses, which in the end turns into nothing other than nihilism, where evil rules over good. So the primary place one encounters something like transcendence is, in the end, horror movies, where it is the transcendent absent of any good, and one that is governed by indestructible evil. Perhaps the final logic of the displacement of the sacred in modern film, i.e. various configurations of the split world and morality and concern for victims, eventuates into exactly the demonic, the world where no transcendent exists other than evil. One wonders if horror movies are revealing the truth about the logic of atheism's display sacred and its failed attempts to find it otherwise. Is atheism's logic simply, in the Kierkegaardian sense, demonic? Belief in no God, no transcendence, only evil. Where then is the sacred in modern film? Perhaps primarily in the transcendence of evil, the demonic. Recall, the demonic is precisely for Kierkegaard wanting to make a self by yourself, apart from what he calls the power that posited you, which is God, apart from the power that gave you your essence and nature. It seems this is precisely the existentialist ethic of Nietzsche, of the Übermensch, the ethic of radical self-creation and freedom, one that shrugs off essentialism and self-creates according to no external value other than the one it gives itself. Just one more thing about Barbie. Heidegger argues that Nietzscheanism is essentially nothing more than the making of the subject the ground of the metaphysical world of meaning, i.e. the subject becomes God, something Nietzsche would agree with in a way. Again, in what Kierkegaard called the demonic, namely wanting to be a self, to create a self apart from God. The only movie that had the boldness to go there was Barbie, ending on existentialism. But such an ending without love, like that of Twister, no love story, feels vapid, devoid of meaning, and pointless, which is precisely, I think, the point for Nietzsche. A question, and so this is a question, not a conclusion, is the demonic, in both the literal, but more so in the Kierkegaardian sense, one and the same reality, and perhaps the only vestige left of the sacred and its other failed instantiations? That is the existential self, the self that seeks to be a self by itself, to be its own God, and the conceiving of reality as meaningless, immanent flux, devoid of any transcendence, and perhaps even dominated by evil, two sides of the same reality. So that's the end. I just have a couple questions I want to just throw out there. Am I okay in time?
You're good.
Okay. Just some questions to consider here. Generally about the stuff I talked about. Consider the ways in which modern horror films shifted from meta films like Scream and Cabin in the Woods, films that are self-aware of their formal structure. They know the characters, this person's going to die next, they're kind of self-reflective and talking you through it, versus these meta films where the formal structure is not only deconstructed, but destroyed altogether, where evil always wins and no one is safe. We seem to conflate, in modern film, creativity with the novel and the destruction of traditional values. Moreover, one of the things that bothers me in modern film is we can't seem to want to conclude anything. We want the same thing over and over again. So we bring back Darth Sidious or the Emperor. Wolverine is resurrected. Nothing wants to conclude. And the problem is, if no one can die, why is anything worth fighting for? There remains no infinitude, there remains no finitude, but infinitude, but not in the transcendent. And I don't think this lack of concluding anything is just driven by greed or consumerism or capitalism. I think it's the lack of imagination, the lack of sacred imagination. Another interesting thing, back to that Adorno quote, good art critiques culture, bad art represents it, or popular art. That means, are series like The Chosen, is this somehow good art in the Adorno sense? Or are Hallmark movies with their traditional format now countercultural? I don't know if you've seen their countercultural. I want to tell you one thing I want to say. When Dave asked me to do this talk, maybe, I'm a Catholic Christian, and I remember the priest I knew maybe 20 years ago, my spiritual director, gave me a great line on movies. How many of you have seen the movie Clueless? Okay, some of you will get this. All right, remember the end of the movie? This is not really related to what I'm talking about, I just wanted to add this. Because I think it's the best analysis of the sacred in film. He just walks up to me one day, this priest, and he goes, "Have you seen the movie Clueless?" I said, "Yeah, I love that movie." "You don't remember the end, what happens, what she says by the fountain?" I go, "Yeah, that she's in love with Josh." He goes, "That's right. The meaning of life is to realize you're in love with Josh." And I thought, oh, Joshua is Yeshua, is the Anglican, is Jesus. So he was like, and I said, "Is that what you mean?" He goes, "That's right." He just walked away. But there's something about that, next time someone asks you the meaning of life, well, it's at the end of Clueless. It's you have to realize you're in love with Josh. Anyway, okay, that's it. I'll take questions. Okay?
Hi. Yeah, I wanted to get clarification about one of your points and then make a comment if the clarification goes a certain way. So, are you arguing that, in the case of Barbie, the existentialist nature of it makes it less meaningful?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, because, what's meaningful about just choosing? Think about value. Do I put value on the world, or does value come at me? I'm more from the phenomenological tradition that says I value things. I don't know. I didn't choose to value something. It's coming at me. So I think just the idea of creation of values. That's not my experience of how I value things.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I think it's very interesting because you did bring up a very interesting point about how the structure of hierarchy of like sex by like reproductive organs.
Yeah.
I would say that a combination of like the existential nature of you are free to choose. You can.
Yeah.
Like that concept combined with the lack of, basically sex as a thing, that somehow I think could also give more meaning to the piece as this, if society was not structured the way it was by sex, then this could be a product of that situation that is jarring and different.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Are you saying that, and I think this is the insight of existentialism, that there's something about essentialism that's oppressive and it determines you. And so to liberate yourself from a sort of fixed essence whether it be sexual or whatever, there is a kind of freedom. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Okay. I was just curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I like it. I think it's good. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned free guy and Barbie.
Yeah.
So besides love and death, is there another way to reach self-consciousness and freedom, do you think?
You mean in reality?
No, in terms of other film.
In other film? I don't know. That's a good question. I was just thinking about those two. I'd have to think about that. But certainly they're contrasted. Like, thinking about your death versus falling in love, then you become free. I prefer the free idea, or the idea of free guy, that love will awaken you to your own freedom. And Kierkegaard actually writes about this, love and freedom in the concept of anxiety. He says, what do we mean by freedom? He flirts with the idea of just pure self-creation. He actually says, free, from I think the Middle English, the word free comes from freon, which means to love. And so we get the word freon, like a friend, someone you love. So free, and the word free and love are the same word from Old English or Middle English. You can look it up. You have the computer there. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have an answer about.
Yeah, so you assert that, sorry.
Oh, that never is.
I was
It's not going to be that good. Do assert. Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
So you was, oh gosh. Oh no.
No, hit me. Go ahead.
Okay. So you assert that without some sort of divine power, right? So if there's infinite universes or what have you, that any sort of moral choice has no meaning, right? So that like within you gave the examples of when the moralistic standing of a movie, saying that like, okay, you need to like the self-sacrifice of Deadpool or something, that it doesn't make sense within the context of an infinite amount of universes or a lack of the divine.
Yeah.
And I guess my question is, my initial reaction to that is that even if there are infinite universes, and even if theoretically there is no divine, I think that even in that circumstance, the choice within like a certain circumstance to do good or do bad, I think that still holds value.
Sure. This is a great question. So I want to first be clear. I think Nietzsche is saying that, and I'm agreeing with Nietzsche. Number one. I think what you're asking, though, trades on a maybe question of, do you mean subjective or objective value? Absolutely, you can have subjective value. What do you mean by that? Does it mean something? Does it matter? However, it's not justified by anything transcendent. So even the idea of good versus evil, it starts to become detached. So why call that good and that evil? I mean, yeah, so I agree with you that you can still find things meaningful in a subjective sense. They just wouldn't have any objective meaning. So
Okay.
it's very insightful.
Okay, so is the idea that without an element of transcendence, there is no objective sense at all?
Depends what you mean by objective sense.
Well, if something is objectively good or objectively bad,
Yeah,
or
I think that's
if this thing is objectively, within space over there, like,
Yeah,
are those things no longer the case if there is no absolute?
Yeah, I think that's what Nietzsche's saying.
Okay.
Yeah, because back to this idea, if the world is, if there's no moral or intelligible way to carve up the world, Plato says, like, does the world carve up at the joints, or is it us putting it there? If that's true, then power becomes the primary way to understand the world, and power bifurcates into strong and weak. And what Nietzsche says is, well, why prefer the weak? Why not, why not help the strong? And Nietzsche says in Antichrist 2 and Antichrist 7, compassion thwarts the law of evolution, which preserves what's ripe for destruction. The weak and the ill-constituted shall perish, and I shall help them to do so. This is the law of my philanthropy. You read the Antichrist, and it's the only, I think I agree with Gerard, or the only philosophy that could justify something like Hitlerism or Nazism, where the concern for victims is completely eradicated. So yeah, that's a great question. Great comment. Dan.
Thanks, Duane. I agree with you that our contemporary culture is fundamentally Christian, and that it's unsatisfactory, and further that the way out is the sacred imagination. But I'm wondering if you could, I'm just not sure, you said that there's no metaphysical foundation for the ethics in contemporary culture. But it seems to me that that's the point. They're claiming that the ethics it's a metaphysics of morals, rather than a metaphysics in the traditional sense. And further, that there's no ultimate, that there's no transcendence.
Yeah.
But again, I'm not sure that that's the case, because it's the transcendence of the choice. It's transcendent from the realm of experience, and it's a noumenal choice. And so why is that not to me, the problem is that it's a transcendence that becomes ultimately unmoored from any sort of immanence.
I think I'm hanging on. I think I follow this, but are you talking about like something like Kantian trend? Kantian
It seems to me that Nietzsche is our culture is Nietzschean, and Nietzsche is a Kantian, and
Oh, I see.
but really this is the fundamental description of our culture.
Which is
Kantian.
is the Kantian?
And Kant says,
Oh, I
this
see. Yeah,
is a metaphysics, it's just a metaphysics of morals,
Yeah.
and we have a radical notion of transcendence.
Okay, I anticipated this question from Wayne if he came here. But my friend who's a Kantian asked me the same question after I read in his paper, and we both agreed that reason has a kind of transcendental quality to it for Kant. And Nietzsche talks about this in Twilight of the Idols, that as the sacred starts, when God dies, the sacred starts moving in different places, and he sees Kant as like on the way to just an absolute eradication of the sacred. And so Kant is just a sort of stage on the way of just another instantiation of God, because it's transcendent. That's what we would say. But you're right. I think there's something to explore there that I haven't thought about carefully enough. I wonder if you could argue, because Kant argues that it's in the act, in the free act, you give yourself the law and then you submit to it. Yeah, is that what you're saying? Yeah, that's great. That's great.
But I agree with you that in the end, this can't provide the ground of value.
Yeah, yes. Yeah. You had your hand up then.
It was basically the same question. Pretty much, I have some clarifying questions first. Just to clarify, are you saying that the transcendent value of morality, or morality in general, or ethics in general, or the ideas that is not the Nietzschean arguments, does that require a God, or does that require a transcendent idea? Or is there a specific God you'd like to argue for?
So the question is, the way I think about this question is great. I like the way you phrased it. What do we mean by an ethical? What do we mean by ethics? What's the difference between like an ethical judgment and an aesthetic judgment? And I would say, well, the ethic judgment purports to be universal and necessary. It obligates everybody and it applies to everybody. Now, can you have universality and necessity? Like racism is wrong. Racism is always wrong. It's wrong here. It's always been wrong. Where do you get that from? Where do you get the universality and necessity of that if there's no transcendent object? Now, I agree with Nietzsche. There isn't one. And Nietzsche says ethical judgments are the same as judgments of taste. So what you really mean, and I think Bertrand Russell said this too, I just don't like racism. I can't say that it's absolutely wrong and everyone's obligated to do it, or to avoid it, rather. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't believe in a Christian God specifically, but I am someone who believes in an objective sense of morality.
Yeah, so I'm not saying you have to believe in the Christian God, but there has to be some transcendent way of. Yeah.
I want to know, I'm not a naturalist, but I want to know what your take would be on some sort of naturalist idea of the idea that there are objective morals for humanity or ethics, specifically because it perpetuates and it is a universal value that is preferable to the other universal value for the continuation of people alive right now. Someone who might argue, well, we had originally death was preferable to life, but then those people died out, so we don't have that anymore.
Are you talking Sam Harris, The Moral Landscape?
Sam Harris, yeah, something. I'm not arguing for him. I want to know what your take would be on something similar to Sam Harris.
Yeah, I think Sam Harris is basically a kind of Aristotelian flourishing argument. And I would use Kant's argument against Aristotle, that Aristotle can account for universality, but it really devolves into judgments of prudence about, if you want to be happy, if you want to flourish, then do this. But it can't command universally and necessarily. And the other thing that I think Sam Harris doesn't account for is that the way he understands values are heavily influenced by Christianity, I think, and Judeo-Christianity. This is a great point. Yeah. Yes?
You used the quote, "There are critiques culture." I didn't get the second part.
This is Adorno. Adorno wrote a book on aesthetics that I had to read. And it's just all one paragraph. It's like 500 pages of just one paragraph. I got through like 100 pages, and what I got out of it was good art critiques culture, bad art just reflects culture, the values of it. And it has to do with capitalism and things like this because it's easy. Yeah, there's not a lot of money in critiquing culture and things like that. Yeah.
Okay. I'm curious what you think about how much objective beauty plays into good art. Specifically, Christian art that reveals that which is objectively good, which is God Himself. So, like David Handel's Messiah.
Yeah.
That's good art, but was created in a time where Christianity was the culture, the basis for the culture at that time.
Yeah. So I think I know what you're asking, and I'll say generally I'm a Platonist, so I believe in like there's like the forms are floating out there beyond space and time. So like two is also floating out there beyond space and time. So I think absolutely good art reflects some transcendent form. That's my sense of it, or archetypes or whatever you want to, Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Thank
That
you.
makes more sense.
Yeah.
Here now that it comes from Adorno.
Yeah.
I want to try to say Star Wars with Jesus, just for. And
It's good to see you, by the way.
I'm not. It's good to see you. I'm not sure this works, but I'm thinking of the saying of Jesus: "You should be in the world, but not of the world." Okay.
Yeah.
And struggling with this idea of personal morality, conviction, sort of in a Kierkegaardian sense, and politics.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now to Star Wars. Could it be possible that the Jedi Knight has to be more Kierkegaardian in terms of existence? But when the whole battle happens, it's happening sort of in the political sphere, which is going to be, in the end, more of a victim winner take all sort of orientation. But in order to exist in that, as Jedi, you have to be connected more to the essential.
Yeah, I would think though that, so I think I know what you're asking. Does it sound, I would say no, it can't. It has to, why wouldn't you follow the balance? Why would you, so it would mean that if good was winning a little too much, you gotta kill some people, victimize some people so you get a nice balance. That's all, yeah.
What if it is the internal?
I'm not saying you should do that.
So in the Jedi, right? What if in the Jedi one has to be conscious of the dark side within the Jedi in order to be connected with the transcendent?
That's what I think they're saying in the new trilogy, that the Jedi were wrong and they tried suppressing this, and they really should have given in to their, I think that's true. I think that is very insightful. I think that's what they're saying. I don't agree with that. I think it would be, depends on what you mean by that. I guess there's a kind of so there's a book I read years ago on Taoism and Christianity and how they related. So the idea of balance actually was, they were relating the Taoist conception of yin and yang to the Augustinian notion of good and evil as a lack or a privation of being, and they were saying, well, no, being ought to be ordered. And evil is the disorder, which is actually a non-being. So I think that would be the way you do something.
But if connection, if connection to the dark side leads to repentance, then see that works towards. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. So do you mean like I know Tolkien makes use of this. How Frodo he tempted at the end.
Tolkien is much better than Star Wars.
Yeah, absolutely. But I remember the first time I saw Lord of the Rings, and Frodo gets tempted by the ring, and Gollum knocks it down. I'm like, what the hell was that? What, really? The hero fails? And so I think that you had that in Star Wars as well. He turns to the dark side, and then, if you end at Episode 6, The Return of the Jedi, which the other ones are, by the way, deuterocanonical apocryphal texts. We don't count them; they're not part of the canon. It is 4, 5, and 6. But he turned to the dark side to get close, and then he eradicates the Sith. So he did fulfill the prophecy. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
This might be a dumb question. I'm just a humble theater student. So,
No.
I guess my question is, can the sacred be made legible on film? Because there are movies like The Color of Pomegranates and Andrei Rublev, which are explicitly about the sacred, but maybe not the experience of it, or you can see like this has some sacred meaning, though I can't understand it, and I guess along with that is maybe easier to imagine, easier to portray.
Well, that's interesting. I think maybe you're right about that. Yeah, it's hard to portray. It's hard to portray Jesus. Like you think of I watched The Chosen, which I like. But it's not totally Jesus. You get glimpses of it, or like Jesus of Nazareth from the 70s. He just never smiles. He's just put the loaves in the basket of people, and then at the end of the movie when he says, "I give you the command to love one another," I'm like, this guy doesn't love anybody. But I think that's right. Evil is the best. Evil is much easier to depict and transcendent. But I feel like, Dan, you'd be good to answer this question too about what the saturated phenomena is. And there are sacramental ways of showing it, but it always hides itself as well. Sacred is very elusive. Now, last thing about this, but it reminds me of, an Aristotelian told me this, so if there are any Aristotelians in here, you could verify this, that he was reading one of these obscure texts of Aristotle, like on animals or something, or history of dreams or whatever, one of these things that no one reads. And Aristotle has this quote that God is like, when you get a glimpse of God, it's like someone just quick went around a corner. And you went, oh, what was that? And you can't find it. And that's the experience of God, that he's just, oh, somebody went right around the corner there. And there's a Protestant preacher who talks about God like, it's a song you hear this song humming in a house, and you start like opening the windows looking for it, but you can't find it. So I think that's a great question. Yeah, so I agree. I think it's very difficult. Yes?
Yeah, that question, and the discussion of the Jesus in hell, do you think Jesus has been whitewashed in media? And if so, to what extent and why?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Do I think Jesus is tamed down? Yeah. Now The Chosen is they're trying to give him a little edge. And I keep up with it. I watch the new season, and he's kind of mean in the new season. Like he's not, and it relates to what Michael Foley was talking about last night about it's a little on the nose. It's telling, not showing. It's talking about it's sort of theologizing suffering. I think it's hard to do that. Is that what you mean by that? I think it's very difficult to depict Jesus.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great question. Yes.
Yeah, I have a kind of practical question, if you're willing to entertain it, tying to last night's talk.
Yeah.
In Everything Everywhere All at Once, I'm wondering what you would, this is my experience, I'm wondering what you would say to someone who's like, I really love this movie. In the ending, I didn't find cringy or embarrassing, but I found very meaningful, and like, it made me feel like I should love those around me. And I'm wondering what you might think, like, is that just like a shallowness of our culture? This is like, oh, it's opening things up for me, this movie.
Yeah.
But I've noticed a lot of people that I'm friends with really enjoyed this movie. I mean, I also talked about this, that I'm more on your side.
Yeah.
But I'm just curious what you would say to someone who's like, no, this is not just existentialism, but an existential turn to others or something.
Yeah. Well,
enough for me.
Your paper was very helpful in thinking about this. You know, as I'm reading this and thinking about what you said, and it sort of goes back to your question about meaning. And I think, I think people. Maybe I didn't like it because I'm thinking about this stuff all the time. Nietzsche, I see it everywhere now. But yeah, there's something beautiful about and attractive about love. I think love and kindness and compassion, these are universal values, and it does pull at our, I think it's real. So I think, I think it would be very, very possible. I mean, it didn't win an Academy Award. I think it was a lot of people, I think, were moved by the movie. I'm just bothered by it doesn't make sense in the movie. I think, though, any genuine experience of love is transcendent. It's like the way Plato talks about the beautiful. You think it's somehow beyond. It's this form that pulls you. I would think that way about love as well.
So even when it floats free of its logic and people don't maybe notice it because it's being covered up, it can still have that same effect.
Yeah, absolutely can have that effect. It's just not logically consistent. Yeah, Wayne.
I checked the Oxford English Dictionary to look up the word nihilism.
Yeah.
And it said it was the denial of religious and moral principles.
Ooh, yeah.
And I think that we've been a long time paving the road to Nietzsche's death of God and whatever's beyond good and evil. Napoleon asked Lamarck, where's God in your system? And Lamarck allegedly answered, I have no need of that hypothesis.
Yeah.
Why? Why did he think he didn't need the transcendent? Because he thought that science and natural experience could suffice.
Yeah.
Can't. That's the question this whole discussion is raising. Can it? Will it?
Yeah. Are you asking me?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. I agree with Nietzsche that I think science is just a form of Christianity. It depends on how serious you are. And for that, the reason I think that is because I'm very interested in mathematics and philosophy of mathematics. And the only position I think that can come, that people push against Platonism on, is most mathematicians are Platonists. However, is Kant's, which was later developed by a guy named Brouwer into intuitionism. I think intuitionism is wrong. But I think science is so heavily reliant on mathematics and mathematics. What's going on there? How does some guys, or someone sit down at the desk, write this equation, and then 70 years later they use it? Like they predicted, I guess, the Higgs boson 60 years before they could even measure it. How are we doing that? And there's an article, The Unreasonable Applicability of Mathematics. Why does it work? Why can we sit down, So, yeah, I think I agree with Nietzsche that science is in a way Christian. Now, unless you're a scientific, like an instrumentalist or an anti-realist that says, well, this is just a model that makes predictions. I don't know, it has nothing to do with the world. But I think we by nature desire to know. We want to believe in what's true. Yeah, that's a great question. Yes. Hi.
Sorry, can you just explain more clearly what you mean by science being the next step of Christianity?
Yeah, so this is not my theory, it's Nietzsche's. He thinks that insofar as, again, the quote we want to look at is Essay 3, 24, Genealogy of Morals. And in it, he says, I could probably pull it up very quickly, but he says something like, insofar as I'm looking for an underlying intelligibility in the world, I'm still splitting the world in two then, because I'm looking for some kind of law underneath it all. I'm making the appearance reality distinction. And so, and A. B, this idea that it's better for me to tell the truth than not, or look for truth, rather than just lie to myself and lie to other people. There's almost a religious quest there in that we think the truth will set us free, so to speak. There's also an essay, which I love, called On Truth and Lying, the Extra Moral Sense. And Nietzsche thinks that if Darwinian evolution is true, and C.S. Lewis has made this argument, Alvin Plantinga, that the reliability of our cognitive faculties would be called into question. There's a guy named Donald Hoffman. He's a new evolutionary psychologist who argues that the name of the book is The Case Against Reality. And the whole book argues that we have no way of knowing what reality is. They run these Monte Carlo simulations in evolutionary game theory of an organism that sees reality as it is, and an organism that's just attuned to fitness. This one always works out better. And then Hoffman explains how we don't have anything to do, we don't know reality at all. But he's telling, but there's, again, of course, a self-referential incoherence about that. Because he's saying that, look, we don't know anything about reality, and I'm telling you about it, so I can sort of fly above everything and see the whole thing. And I think Nietzsche is very aware that if you take this hypothesis too seriously, you'll destroy rationality. Yeah. Great question. It's now 11 o'clock, I think, my time. So if I pass up, just please.
Any further? I'm going to invoke director's privilege, and I want you to show one of the clips and just briefly talk about it. So pick your favorite one of those, and we'll end with that. How about
Okay. Well, I don't know. There's everything everywhere all at once. I won't show that. The Matrix. I'll show Barbie. Everybody likes Barbie. Yes.
Sorry, one last question.
Yeah.
You were saying that like if we deny reality or like what is true, just if we like start digging too deep that we're like ignoring or like that we like lose our perception of reality. Is that what you're talking about? Like in class we're reading about like Descartes and he's like he was talking about how like we only really know that I exist and that there's a higher being, but like I'm just curious on what you do about it.
I see what you're asking. This is a great question. I think Nietzsche would say that anytime you have a disagreement with someone, every disagreement is gaslighting. So you're always, like anytime you're in an argument with someone, you have to gaslight them because there isn't any reality to arbitrate the differences in perspective. It's just a matter of perspective that determines truth.
Right.
So yeah, that's a very interesting point. Yeah, because it's the sort of logical conclusion of a radical perspectivism, that there isn't any reality that we can both turn to and say, oh, there it is. I mean, you can't do that conventionally, but real important things are completely subjective. It's just a matter of force and power, and whether you can trick someone.
Okay.
Yeah, very good, very good. You still want me to show this?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. It's the 2 seconds. This is where he says, you want to sleep over. What happened?
It'll come back on. It's on the other. There we go.
Wow.
You can go now.
I thought I might stay over tonight.
Why?
Because we're girlfriend, boyfriend.
To do what?
I'm actually not sure.
Oh, but I don't want you here.
Is it Ken?
Ken's just a really good friend, and this is my dream house. It's Barbie's dream house. It's not Ken's dream house, right?
Right, as always.
And it's girls' night. Hi, Barbie!
Hurry up, the president's here.
I am, you're welcome.
Every night's girls' night.
Every night, forever.
Every night.
Sure, we're ready to open. Good night.
Okay, so, by the way, I did not want to watch this movie. I had to be dragged to watch this movie. And then I loved it. Like 10 minutes in, I'm like, this is awesome. And then it got better and better. I think when he's singing the Matchbox 20 song, I must have replayed that 15 times and laughed, like a belly laugh. I couldn't breathe. But so what I find interesting about the whole movie, I've been thinking about what we mean by, gender, sex, and what these categories mean. There's a conservative guy that goes around asking people what a woman is. These are questions that are very interesting. So I've been reading feminism for the last 7 or 8 years, and I was surprised to find as early as the second wave, it's in de Beauvoir. And she has an essay on motherhood that's controversial. The second sex, particularly if you're interested in this, the second sex, there's a chapter called The Lesbian and The Woman in Love. And they're very helpful on this idea. And again, it's also in Monique Wittig. She has an essay titled, it's a very short essay, maybe 15 pages, called Woman is Not Born, She's Made. And then Shulamith Firestone's book, The Dialectic of Sex. I was surprised, the way I thought about, the way feminists thought about patriarchy was that men got together in a cabal and went, ha ha ha, now we oppress the women. And what actually they're saying is no, and it comes from a Marx, I think it's in the German ideology, where Marx says like the sex act is the first division of labor, something like that. And so it's much more complicated than that. And it's actually the enslavement to the reproductive process which causes the need for patriarchy. I mean, we were talking about this today. Our human beings, our skulls, our brains are so big that we're born premature. And if women's hips were any bigger, they wouldn't be able to run. Because, this is an evolutionary thing, but the child is basically, it can't even move for the first, I don't know, when is a child, it just sits there like this for months, right? And your brain isn't really formed until you're 25. And so human children require a lot of care, a lot of nursing, a lot of this stuff. And what the feminists are saying is if women just, 500 years ago, women would probably have 10 to 15 kids, half of which would die in childbirth, 50% infant mortality rate. And so you have a really dark, oppressive world. The world of nature is oppressive, and then men and women, these gender roles come out of that. But this is not Duane. This is what I read in de Beauvoir, Wittig, certainly Firestone. And so I think this world works like this, where they don't know what is he? He's like an accessory. It's like when who was talking about when children were playing with the Barbie dolls. Was it Michael from last night? Who was talking about that today? Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, the Ken doll is just thrown to the side because there's really no.
Yeah, that's how he agreed to. That's how he decided to take it apart.
Yeah. Oh, right. Yeah.
Play with Barbies, and the Ken was like thrown in the mud on the side.
Yeah. So right. So it's just interesting for me to think about, that how much gender. This is my theory. That this isn't related to what I'm talking about, but I think because you're wondering what does it mean? What do we mean by man, woman, masculine, feminine? I think those roles are defined in sexual relations, in reproduction, and as we liberate ourselves from the reproductive process, birth control is more available now, and you see gender start to bend much more than it has, and of course some of that is because of acceptance of certain things, but I also think it's related to the roles that are implied by nature. So nature is sort of tyrannical, I think, for the feminists. So certainly the second wave feminists. Now Judith Butler says something like even biological sex is a construct of patriarchy, which is something a little bit further, but people are flirted with that as well. So that would be my take on that.
Let's thank our speaker.